Journey into the unknown. The sky burned with the dying light of a retreating sun, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Day's vibrant colours, the deep purples and molten oranges, bled into twilight, casting a tapestry of shadows across the land. Against this ethereal backdrop, two figures raced through the heavens. Alaria, a young elf, her form gleaming under the fractured rays of sunlight, and Noctilux, a red dragon whose wings sliced the air with raw, determined power. The wind was relentless, an invisible force battering them both, clawing at Alaria's tattered azure cloak, catching in her golden hair. A brilliant mane streaked with strands of deep blue, like a reflection of her determined eyes. She tightened her grip on the reins, feeling every muscle in Noctilux's body working beneath her, each beat of his wings an effort to outpace the dark shapes chasing them. Their pursuers, the black dragons, their sleek forms nothing more than shadows against the vibrant sky, remained relentless, their eyes glinting with cold intent. They were predators, and this was their hunt. Alaria's armor, once a resplendent testament to her people's skill, bore the scars of the trials she had endured. Gold, faded now, still caught the last glimmers of light, though here and there the plates were tarnished, scratched, and dented. The fine engravings, once pristine and intricate, told tales of past battles, where she was not always the victor, but where she had always survived. Strapped across her back, her bow was carved from pale wood, infused with ancient magic, ready to sing its deadly tune at her command. And secured to Noctilux's saddle was her lance, a weapon of necessity when fighting on a dragon, its long shaft tipped with a gleaming silver head that had tasted the blood of many foes. And by her side, her twin swords hung in readiness, crafted for speed, their blades a promise of swift justice. Yet, for all her weapons, all her armor, it was not steel or skill alone that gave her courage now. It was the living bond she shared with Noctilux. Beneath her, Noctilux was a force of nature, a young dragon, yet a giant even among his kind. His scales blazed like the heart of a forge, a vibrant red that darkened to crimson along the ridge of his spine, reflecting the final, fading embers of the day. Scars latticed his sides, old ones faded to a dull pink, and fresh marks where claws and teeth had torn into him during battles past. His deep amber eyes scanned the horizon ahead, searching for a sanctuary among the dense forest that loomed miles away. He had fought through pain before, and though exhaustion pulled at his muscles, he refused to falter. For her. Alaria, came his voice, not spoken aloud, but resonating within her mind, a connection that ran deeper than mere words. The rumble of his thoughts echoed like distant thunder, filled with urgency. They are closing in. We cannot keep this up much longer. Her heart clenched at his words. She turned her head to glance back, the sight making her breath catch. The black dragons were gaining, their wings beating with a synchronized rhythm, their riders, cloaked in darkness, mere shadows that seemed to meld into the beasts they rode. Their relentless pursuit felt almost inevitable, like the creeping darkness of night swallowing the last light of the day. But Alaria refused to let despair take her. "Just a little further, Noctilux," she called, her voice barely audible above the rush of wind. She pressed herself closer to his neck, feeling the warmth radiating from his body. "We can lose them in the forest." Yet Noctilux's thoughts touched hers again, softer now, heavy with concern. "There is another way. You could jump, Alaria. I will lead them away. You'd be safe in the woods." His gaze flicked from the approaching dragons to the dense treetops ahead, and she could feel the tension in his body, the hesitation, the unwillingness to make such a suggestion, but also the determination to protect her, no matter the cost. "You must survive!" The words sliced through her, sharper than any blade. Leave him. The thought was unbearable. The bond they shared was not just that of rider and dragon. It was something deeper, forged over years of friendship, a connection of heart and soul. They had known each other since her earliest memories, and Noctilux had been her companion, her guardian, her other half. To abandon him now, to let him face such danger alone, it was unthinkable. "Don't you dare suggest that again!" She growled, her voice trembling with emotion, her eyes narrowing against the stinging wind. "If we fall together. I will not leave you. Not now. Not ever." Noctilux let out a sigh, a deep rumbling sound that vibrated through her, a mixture of exasperation and resignation. "Stubborn as always," he murmured, but she could sense the warmth behind his frustration, an affection that was undeniable. She was more than his rider. She was family, the only one who mattered to him, and he would fight until his last breath to protect her. Ahead, the forest rose like a dark wave, an ocean of green and black that promised shelter from the relentless sky. The branches seemed to reach for them, their leaves rustling like whispers of hope, urging them forward. It was so close now, close enough that Alaria could feel the promise of safety, of respite from the hunt. The treetops undulated below them, a living thing, shifting and swaying with the wind, and Alaria's pulse quickened. They could make it. They just had to hold on. Behind them, a roar split the sky, a raw, primal sound that seemed to shake the very heavens. Alaria's heart skipped a beat, and she cast another glance over her shoulder. The black dragons were so near now, their jaws gaping, eyes glinting with cruel intent. The riders were nothing more than dark silhouettes, their forms hidden beneath heavy cloaks, but their eyes burned with a terrible hunger. Alaria's fingers tightened on the reins, the leather biting into her palms. She could feel the cold steel of her swords at her side, the weight of her bow across her back, reassurances, symbols of her strength. But they meant nothing without Noctilux. He was her true weapon, her shield, her partner in every sense of the word. "Almost there," she whispered, her words lost in the wind, her gaze fixed ahead on the dark canopy that beckoned them. They would dive into that darkness, vanish from sight, and find a way to outwit their pursuers. They had to. Together, they were stronger than any foe. Noctilux's wings beat with renewed strength, the muscles straining, every fibre of his being focused on reaching the forest. He could feel Alaria's faith in him, her unwavering belief that they would make it, and it fueled him, drove him onward. The treetops loomed closer, the darkened branches like fingers ready to pull them into the safety of the shadows. The last light of the day slipped beneath the horizon, and for a heartbeat the world seemed suspended between light and darkness, between hope and despair. Alaria and Noctilux plunged into the forest, the branches parting to swallow them whole, the shadows wrapping around them like a protective shroud. The dense forest exploded with chaos. Branches snapped like brittle bones under immense force, and the wind whipped into a frenzy as one of the black dragons and its rider closed the distance, barreling after Alaria and Noctilux into the thicket below. The air filled with the deafening roar of breaking trees and the terrifying rush of wind. Before they could react, a massive force collided with Noctilux from behind, the momentum of the black dragon propelling them both into the earth. There was no grace to the crash, just the raw, violent energy of two colossal creatures, scales scraping and claws flailing. The two dragons, intertwined in a brutal mess of wings and tails, crashed through the underbrush, tearing a path of destruction as they slammed into the forest floor, skidding through dirt and splintering smaller trees that stood in their way. Alaria held on desperately as Noctilux's body tumbled, her vision blurring from the impact, her body battered by the force. For a fleeting moment, she lost all sense of direction as they ploughed through the forest, and the world around her spun wildly. She was thrown from her saddle, her golden armor clinking against the ground as she landed with a hard, breath-stealing thud, sliding across the leaf-covered earth. Above, she caught a glimpse of the second black dragon circling, its dark silhouette barely visible through the branches and leaves, a hunter seeking its prey, but unable to pinpoint their exact location. Her head rang, her body bruised, but she forced herself to move, to stand. Her fingers gripped the hilt of one of her swords, her knuckles white, her breathing ragged as she struggled to find her bearings. Through the branches, she spotted Noctilux, a little farther ahead, slowly rising. His massive form pushed against the earth, shaking the dust from his scales. His wings twitched, one partially spread as if testing for injury. Relief washed over her. He was alive, still standing. But before she could make her way to him, a flash of movement caught her eye. From the shadows of the underbrush, the rider of the black dragon lunged at her, a fierce, dark-cloaked figure with a sword drawn. The blade gleamed with a cruel light, and Alaria barely had time to react. Instinct took over as she parried the strike, her own sword ringing against the black steel of her assailant's weapon. The force of the blow jarred her arm, but she gritted her teeth, her feet digging into the soft earth as she twisted away from the rider's relentless assault. He was taller than her, stronger perhaps, his strikes heavy and aggressive, each one driving her back a step. His face was obscured by a dark helm, only his eyes visible, cold, determined, devoid of mercy. Alaria's mind sharpened, her focus narrowing to the blade before her, the dance of attack and defense. She moved with agility, her armor, though battered, still granting her the protection she needed. She ducked beneath a swing meant to take her head, the air whistling as the blade passed just above, and retaliated with a quick slash of her own, cutting across the rider's arm. He grunted, his grip faltering for a split second, and Alaria pressed her advantage. She moved inside his guard, her golden hair streaming behind her like a banner, her sword driving forward. The point of her blade found a gap in his armor, slipping beneath the edge of his breastplate, and she pushed with all her strength. The rider gasped, his body tensing as the steel bit deep, and Alaria twisted the blade, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the labored breathing of her opponent before he crumpled, collapsing to the forest floor, lifeless. She staggered back, pulling her blade free, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. There was no time to dwell on the fight. Her gaze shot back to where Noctilux stood, and her heart sank. She saw the black dragon, its scales a deep, malevolent shade that seemed to drink in the dim light of the forest, launching itself at her companion. The two dragons collided with a deafening crash, their massive bodies rolling and slamming into the ground, shaking the earth beneath them. The black dragon, younger and less experienced, moved with a desperate ferocity, its claws slashing at Noctilux's sides, its jaws snapping in an attempt to find purchase on his throat. Noctilux roared, the sound reverberating through the trees, a challenge and a promise of retribution. His wings unfurled, knocking against the black dragon, forcing it back momentarily before the two were locked together once more. Noctilux's tail lashed out, striking the black dragon across the face, the force of the blow staggering his opponent. He reared up, his powerful hind legs digging into the earth before driving forward, slamming into the black dragon's chest. The younger dragon stumbled, its wings flailing as it tried to regain balance, but Noctilux was relentless. He lunged, his jaws closing around the base of the black dragon's neck, his teeth sinking into the thick scales. The black dragon thrashed, its claws raking across Noctilux's side, leaving deep gouges, but Noctilux held firm. With a roar, he twisted his neck, using his immense size and strength to force the black dragon to the ground. The impact shook the forest, leaves raining down from the branches above as Noctilux pinned his opponent, his teeth still locked on the dragon's throat. The black dragon struggled, its eyes wide with panic, but it was no match for Noctilux's power. With one final brutal wrench, Noctilux ended the struggle, the black dragon's body falling limp beneath him. Noctilux released his grip, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his sides heaving. Blood dripped from the wounds on his body, deep gashes that marred his crimson scales. But he was victorious. He looked up, his amber eyes searching, and found Ilaria standing amidst the shattered remains of the forest, her eyes wide with concern and relief. "Are you all right?" she called, her voice shaky but strong, her gaze meeting his. Noctilux nodded, his massive head dipping slightly. "I am still standing," he rumbled, the words filled with exhaustion, but also a quiet determination. He took a step toward her, the earth beneath his feet groaning in protest, and Ilaria rushed forward, her hands reaching out to touch his snout, her fingers gentle against the rough scales. "Good," she whispered, her eyes glistening, "because I'm not leaving you." Noctilux rumbled low in his chest, a sound that was both comfort and determination. He lowered his head further, pressing his snout gently against Ilaria's chest, mindful of his own strength. Ilaria rested her forehead against him for a moment, drawing in his warmth, before stepping back and letting her eyes wander across the dragon's injuries. "Let me see, Noctilux," she said, her voice soft but commanding, a tone he'd heard many times before, a tone he obeyed without hesitation. He shifted, turning slightly to present his side, the crimson scales torn and marked by the claws of his opponent. The deep gashes glistened wetly, dark rivulets of blood slowly trickling down his flanks. Ilaria frowned, reaching into one of her pouches. She pulled out a small vial, its contents shimmering with a faint silver light. It was only a small healing draught meant for minor injuries, but it was all she had. "This might sting," she said, her eyes flickering up to meet his, and Noctilux huffed, a plume of smoke escaping his nostrils in response. Ilaria smiled faintly, uncorking the vial and pouring the liquid along the worst of the wounds. The silvery liquid spread across the torn flesh, sinking into the scales with a soft sizzle. Noctilux winced, a deep rumble of pain vibrating through his chest. But he held still, his massive body trembling only slightly as the potion began its work. The worst of the bleeding stopped, and the wounds knitted together just enough to stave off the danger of infection. But they were still raw, and Ilaria could see the exhaustion in her companion's eyes. She sighed, stepping back. "It's not enough, I know, but it will have to do for now." She glanced around the ruined forest, her eyes narrowing as she looked back up through the branches. The other black dragon was still up there, its shadow passing over the canopy, searching. They needed to act before it found them. Noctilux followed her gaze, his amber eyes narrowing thoughtfully. He turned his head, looking at the limp, broken body of the black dragon lying nearby. "The other one," he said slowly, his deep voice a rumble. "It will not leave until it sees a reason to." Ilaria glanced at him, then at the fallen dragon. Understanding dawned on her, and she gave a nod. "You're right," she said, though her heart clenched at the thought of putting him through any more effort in his state. "If it sees its companion, Maybe it'll think we're still too much to handle. Noctilux gave a low grunt, already moving toward the body of his defeated foe. He gripped the black dragon's tail between his teeth, his powerful jaw clamping down, and with a heavy pull began to drag the corpse. Alaria watched him, her heart aching at the sight of the strain it took. Each step seemed to pull on his wounds, the muscles beneath his scales tensing as he dragged the heavy body through the broken forest floor. Slowly, steadily, Noctilux made his way toward a clearing, the effort visible in the set of his wings, the way his legs braced against the earth with every pull. Branches snapped, and the underbrush parted as the corpse was dragged along. Alaria walked alongside, her hand resting on Noctilux's shoulder, her touch gentle, as if her presence could somehow share his burden. Finally, they reached the clearing. Noctilux paused for a moment, his breath coming in deep, ragged gasps. With a final surge of strength, he lifted his head, swinging the body forward and letting it land with a dull, heavy thud in the open space. The dead dragon's dark scales caught the faint light that filtered through the canopy, a stark contrast to the vibrant crimson of Noctilux. High above, the shadow of the second black dragon passed once more, its rider scanning the forest below. The moment the fallen dragon came into view, there was a shift, a hesitation. Alaria watched as the dark shape slowed, the rider clearly taking in the scene below. The black dragon hovered for a moment, wings beating steadily, then, as if deciding against risking a similar fate, turned away. It rose higher, retreating into the sky, its silhouette fading into the distance. Alaria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her shoulders sagging in relief. "It's leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes following the retreating figure until it disappeared completely. Noctilux lowered his head, his body visibly relaxing, though his exhaustion was clear. Alaria stepped closer, her hand resting against his neck. "You did it!" she said, her voice full of admiration and gratitude. Noctilux let out a tired huff, his eyes meeting hers. "No, we did it," he corrected, his voice low but resolute. He shifted slightly, lowering himself to the ground, his wings folding in close to his body. "Now, we must move. The others may return, and I would rather not be here when they do." Alaria nodded, though she could feel the weariness in her own body, the ache of her ribs from where she had been thrown. She climbed onto Noctilux's back, settling herself against the saddle. She winced as she lay down, her body protesting the movement. But she forced herself to relax, to let the tension drain from her muscles. Noctilux rose slowly, carefully, his wings tucking in close as he began to walk. The forest was dense, the ground uneven, and each step was taken with deliberate care. Alaria lay across his back, her head resting against his warm scales, her eyes half closed as she listened to the steady rhythm of his movements. The forest around them seemed almost peaceful now, the chaos of the battle left behind, replaced by the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant calls of unseen creatures. She could feel Noctilux's strength beneath her, the powerful muscles that carried her despite the wounds and exhaustion. Even injured, even weary, he moved with a determination that filled her with a sense of safety. She closed her eyes, her fingers curling slightly against the saddle. "You should rest," Noctilux said after a while, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate through her entire body. Alaria smiled faintly, her eyes still closed. "I will, once we're somewhere safe," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Noctilux did not argue. He simply marched on, each step steady and sure, his eyes scanning the forest ahead, always alert, always protective. Alaria felt the exhaustion weighing down on her, her body aching, her mind drifting. But she knew, as long as she was with him, she could afford to let go, to trust in his strength. And so they moved through the forest, the bond between them unspoken but ever-present. Noctilux's steps were heavy, but he showed no sign of faltering, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The journey through the dense forest was long and arduous, the shadows deepening as the sun slowly sank beyond the horizon, casting the woods in an eerie twilight glow. Noctilux moved with purpose, his massive form navigating the underbrush with surprising grace despite his size. His claws crunched softly against the earth, and each powerful step seemed to reverberate through Alaria's tired body, lulling her into a state somewhere between wakefulness and sleep. But even amidst her drifting consciousness, Alaria remained aware enough to catch the subtle change in Noctilux's movements. He had slowed, his head lowering as he sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring as if catching the scent of something significant. Slowly, he altered his course, moving toward a rocky incline at the edge of the forest. Through the thick underbrush, a dark opening came into view, a cave, its entrance partially concealed by hanging vines and tangled roots. Noctilux approached cautiously, his amber eyes scanning the shadows within. He stopped just short of the entrance, his head lowering to peer inside, his senses alert to any sign of danger. Alaria, though half-conscious, could feel the change in him, the careful, deliberate way he examined the cavern. She lifted her head, her eyes blinking open, her gaze following his. "Is it safe?" she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper, exhaustion clinging to her every word. Noctilux did not answer at once. He took a step forward, then another, his large frame barely fitting through the entrance as he moved into the cave. The darkness swallowed them, the temperature dropping slightly as the stone walls enclosed them, muting the sounds of the forest outside. Noctilux moved with purpose, stepping deeper and deeper into the cave, his nostrils flaring as he assessed the air for any sign of life. Only once he was satisfied that there was no danger did he relax, his body seeming to release a tension that had been coiled within him since the battle. He moved further in to where the cave widened, creating a small chamber, sheltered and secure. He lowered himself slowly, his wings folding in close as he carefully settled onto the stone floor, his legs tucked beneath him. Alaria slid from his back, her feet touching the ground, though her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She leaned against Noctilux for a moment, her head resting against his side, her eyes closing as she drew in a deep breath. The cool air of the cave was a balm to her heated skin, the stone beneath her feet solid and reassuring. Noctilux turned his head, his gaze softening as he watched her, a low rumble of concern vibrating through his chest. "Rest, Alaria," he said, his voice gentle, almost a whisper in the quiet darkness. "We are safe here." Alaria nodded, though her eyes remained closed, her body swaying slightly with exhaustion. Noctilux shifted, his wing unfolding and extending outward, the leathery membrane brushing gently against her back. He guided her down, creating a small, sheltered space beneath his wing, where she could rest against his warm side, protected from the chill of the cave. With a sigh, Alaria finally allowed herself to let go. She lay down beside him, her body curling slightly as she settled into the space he had created for her. The warmth of his body enveloped her, and she could feel the steady rise and fall of his breath beneath her cheek. Her hand rested lightly against his side, her fingers brushing against the rough texture of his scales. Noctilux watched her for a moment, his gaze softening as her breathing began to even out, the lines of tension slowly fading from her face. Only when he was sure she was asleep did he finally close his own eyes, his body relaxing fully for the first time since their escape had begun. The cave was quiet, the sounds of the forest outside barely reaching them, muffled by the stone walls. The darkness was deep, but it was not threatening. Rather, it was comforting, a blanket that shielded them from the world beyond. Noctilux let out a long breath, his head resting against the cool stone floor, his eyes closing as he allowed himself to rest. For now, they were safe. The forest had given them shelter, the cave a place to regain their strength. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly bring new challenges, new dangers, for this moment, they had peace. And so, the mighty dragon and his rider lay together in the heart of the cave, the bond between them a quiet, unspoken promise. Noctilux's breathing slowed, his body settling into the earth beneath him, his wings folding in to wrap protectively around Alaria's sleeping form. The night pressed on, the world outside continuing its eternal march, but within the cave there was only the gentle rise and fall of two beings, resting at last in each other's presence, their shared strength a light against the darkness.